Thank you very much indeed, Dr. Hume. And we're reminded, of course, that Constable McGee, of course, who was shot dead at Castle Bellingham by insurgents, the man who was sentenced to death for responsibility for that killing was a Belfast man, John Francis McEntee, better known as Sean McEntee, who had a long career in Fianna Fáil politics in the south, and whose sentence was eventually commuted to life imprisonment, but not before his friend, Pottery Gregory, the Belfast poet and Gaelic revivalist, whom he'd visited on Good Friday before he took part in the rising, and given some fragments of his poems. Gregory rushed into print with the book, The Poems of the Late John Francis McEntee, and then he was spared. And he was forever attacked in the Dáil by his political opponents on the pro-treaty side as the poet from Belfast. Our next speaker is Dr. Margaret O'Callaghan, who's senior lecturer in modern Irish politics in the School of Politics, Philosophy and International Studies at Queen's University. A PhD from Cambridge, she is the author of a major study of British high politics in the late Victorian period, focusing on the careers of W. Forster and Arthur Balfour. More recently, Dr. O'Callaghan was co-director of a major North-South research project from 2003, funded by the Higher Education Authority, on the commemoration of the Easter Rising in 1966. And in fact, the research undertaken then has now been published in a book, and Dr. O'Callaghan has a few copies for sale at a discount price of £20, which some people may be interested in either. But her theme tonight follows on from that research, and the Dr. O'Callaghan will be speaking now about commemorating the rising of 1916 in Belfast in 1966. Dr. Margaret O'Callaghan.
The commemoration of the 1916 rising in 1966 is indelibly stamped on the minds of those who lived through it. But of course, for another generation, those born later in the last century, it's virtually unknown. They, however, have heard it discussed, that is, how the rising was commemorated in 1966 on its 50th anniversary. They've heard it discussed to buttress one ideological position or another on 1916 itself, on the Irish nationalist tradition, on the northern conflict of the last 40 years. All of these positions by historians, journalists, or commentators. You could say that much of the battle for control of the representation of the history of modern Ireland and its profound connection with debates about the recent long-term troubles in the north is incomprehensible if the commemoration of 1966 is ignored. The struggle for control of the representation of the nature of the 1966 commemoration has accreted to the debate on 1916 itself in a way that's made it constitutive of it. Such a phenomenon is not unique to Ireland, but in the past 3 decades, the debate about the meaning of commemoration in relation to the state or the nation may have been more immediate and more passionately contested in Ireland than elsewhere. The historian and editor of a highly influential work on the politics of commemoration, John Gillis, has written, "Commemorative activity is by definition social and political. It involves the coordination of individual and group memories, whose results may appear consensual when they are in fact the product of processes of intense contest, struggle, and in some instances, annihilation." So I suppose the important thing to remember there is to remember the nature of the relationship between remembering and forgetting. Commemorations are ostensibly about memory and remembering, but neither remembering nor memory nor itself is unproblematic, as the work of the French historian Pierre Nora demonstrates. If adopting Nora for Irish purposes, it's clear that the Easter Rising of 1916 has been the key site of memory in 20th century nationalist Ireland, rivaled only perhaps by the border. The rising has been embraced, repudiated, analysed, retold, contested, investigated, dismissed and lauded. There's an endless fascination with its history, its ephemera, its traces and its residues. but more importantly, and often regardless of its history in the narrow sense of what actually occurred, 1916 has become a ground of contestation and a battle site for representation. The representation of 1916 has been at the centre of debates about how Ireland's past was to be understood in the last 3 decades of the 20th century. That debate frequently took place through a debate about what had actually happened in the commemorations of 1966. The subtext of the discussion was whether or not the commemorations of 1966 had in fact partly caused the Troubles. If we look at 2006, you could say that the upbeat, expansive commemoration of 1916 in 1966, and oddly in 2006, which was the first year it was kind of highly reinstituted by Bertie Ahern, reflected the temper of those times. Ireland in the 60s is now often seen as a forerunner of the, we now know, short-lived 21st century Celtic tiger. A simplification that, of course, glosses over a long interval marked by economic crises. The mid-60s also brought a significant improvement in relations between Northern Ireland and independent Ireland, with the famous Lemass-O'Neill meetings of '65 and examples of practical cooperation between both states. Irish unity barely featured in the official speeches during the 1966 commemorations in Dublin, and the Dublin and Belfast governments went to some considerable efforts to prevent the commemoration from setting back this improving relationship. Nonetheless, the Rising was commemorated on a significant scale in 1966 by the very Northern Catholics whose marginalisation from civil society in the North was about to give rise to the civil rights movement. One of the aims of the project, which we have now completed, was to retrieve that Northern Nationalist commemoration. Conducted without a state apparatus, but nonetheless indicative of Northern Nationalist desire not to be excluded from the Irish nation and not to acquiesce in a Southern state-sponsored project that sought to make the Irish nation and the Irish state synonymous. The eruption of the Troubles in Northern Ireland in '69, the consequent aftershocks in the Republic, resulted in the 1966 commemoration being retrospectively interpreted as a factor in the resurgence of IRA military activity. This argument, most clearly enunciated by Conor Cruise O'Brien in his 1972 book States of Ireland, and reprised and popularised him by countless epigoni, has dominated perceptions of the Rising. Cruise O'Brien said, "The great commemorative year, '66, a year in which ghosts were bound to walk both north and south. The general call for rededication to the ideals of 1916 were bound to suggest to some young men and women not only that these ideals were in practice being abandoned, through the Lemass-O'Neill meetings and in other ways, but the way to return to them was through the methods of '16, violence applied by a determined minority." Cruise O'Brien conceded that the Lemass government had tried to discourage these conclusions, but in O'Brien's words, there is in fact no way of discouraging them effectively within the framework of what he called the cult of 16. 1966 was of course also the golden jubilee of the Battle of the Somme. And O'Brien said, just as the '66 commemorations in Dublin favoured a recrudescence of the IRA, so the northern commemorations, clashing with those in the south, favoured the recrudescence of armed Protestant extremists. I suppose what Cruise O'Brien's retrospective interpretation, written at the height of the violence in 1972 in Northern Ireland, shared with the intentions of the Irish government in 1966, was a failure to consider the position of Northern Nationalists. From the 1970s onwards, the debate, as I've said, about the status of the commemoration in '66 became embroiled in a further and connected debate about the merits or demerits of the Easter Rising itself, which Fergal's already referred to here this evening, and by extension, over time, reformulated itself into a debate about the status of the Irish Revolution. It can therefore be seen as lying at the centre of the so-called revisionist debate on modern Ireland. The traditional nationalists of revisionist caricature, the revisionists themselves, whoever they are, or we are, And so-called post-nationalists and post-revisionists can be said to have nailed their ideological colours to the mast by their approval or criticism of the kind of commemoration that allegedly took place in 66. Roy Foster in 88 described it as the result of simplistic historical hero cults had become obvious in the carnage of Northern Ireland. He later went on to contrast the 75th anniversary of the Rising in 91, which was treated by the Irish government as a sensitive issue, to what he said was the unequivocal celebration of 66. What Foster saw as the sensitive treatment of the 75th anniversary, Seamus Dean described as an official embarrassment. The contrast between the official commemorations in 66 and 91 appears to have served to accentuate the tendency to distort the images of what actually happened. The 1966 commemoration was an attempt by the Irish government to unite its citizens between 1916 as the formative founding moment in the history of an independent Irish state. 1916, for them, or to Lemass, seemed to have the potential to bring together those who were divided by the Anglo-Irish Treaty and Civil War. By focusing on the ideals of 16, on the subsequent history of the Irish state, Lemass hoped to bring those who had not supported the rising of war of independence into the celebrations, and the record shows he was quite successful in that. But this way of deploying 1916 as a moment that united Irish citizens was something of a novelty, because previous commemorations of the Rising had been contentious and problematic since the 20s, with various parties being excluded from the commemorations at different times. The history of official state 1916 commemorations prior to 1966 in the South, therefore, is one of neglect and relatively low-key events. The 66 commemoration was not just a more elaborate form of the traditional 1916 state commemoration, it was something quite new. 1966 shares one key feature with more recent commemorations, particularly the 06 one, that is an attempt by the Irish state to reclaim the memory commemoration of the Rising from militant Republicans and to establish the commemoration as an event that would unite citizens and consolidate the state. Most men and women who marched to commemorate the Rising in other years before 66 in provincial locations around Ireland were mostly organised by Republican groups who did not recognise the state and wore the Easter lily to highlight that point. This was a tradition in which you could say some Northern nationalists had a part, though having to contend with a more hostile government in Northern Ireland. But commemorations pre-66, North and South, were not wildly dissimilar. 50 years from the Somme and 50 years from the Rising, 1966 was a pivotal moment for the two partitioned entities on the island of Ireland. Sorry, I'm just pouring some water. In hindsight, what is striking are the features that they had in common. Both Northern Ireland and the Republic wished to project images of change. Both sought to project a prosperity that was perhaps more fragile than real. For Lemass's government, the Jubilee, as they called it, which fortuitously coincided with the first sustained rise in population since independence, was an opportunity to showcase a new modern Ireland. Lemass's government, if you look at the records at the time, were determined that the commemoration would not damage improving relations with Dublin and Northern Ireland. Terence O'Neill was equally concerned with image, but even more concerned with how the new Labour government in London would view any Stormont attempt to suppress Northern nationalist commemorations in 66. Hence his reluctance to court the adverse publicity that a ban on particular parades would attract, despite pressures from within his own party. Lemass's government undoubtedly played down any potential threat from the IRA. By contrast, during the 65 Stormont elections, as a result of intelligence he'd received from the Royal Ulster Constabulary, O'Neill initially he changed his position on the potential threat of IRA violence in late 65 and early 66. He initially played up the possibility of IRA violence associated with the Jubilee, but moved back from this early in '66 as extremist Protestant groupings attempted to use the threat of IRA violence to initiate their own. Ian Paisley had been casting around for a platform from which to challenge O'Neill for some years, found it in the commemorations and used it relentlessly, culminating in his April 1966 counter-rally at the Ulster Hall in Belfast, in celebration of the defeat of the rebels in 1916. This marked Paisley's highest point in over a decade of street politics, and that street politics continued throughout the summer of '66 as he challenged O'Neill on the streets and through the columns of his newly founded Protestant Telegraph. Though O'Neill played down the threat posed by Protestant paramilitary violence initially, a sequence of events culminating in the UVF murders of June '66 led to his banning of the UVF and to a political focus on a radically revitalised Paisleyite movement. So I'm just going to skip forward a bit because I know we're tight for time. So who organised the '66 commemorations in Belfast in '66? And they're quite different to those organised in the rest of Northern Ireland. The '66 commemoration in Northern Ireland was more akin to the traditional commemorations held throughout the Republic and the North in other years. A commemoration dominated by parades, mainly though not exclusively, organised by Republicans. The Belfast Parade on the 18th of April and the associated ceremonies in Casement Park were the key events in the Northern commemorative programme, with West Belfast briefly becoming the Republican capital of Ireland. These events were on a grander and more dramatic scale than the traditional parade to Milltown Cemetery, which also took place in '66 and indeed had taken place in other years. This reflected the desire of a section of the Republican movement, particularly around Tomás McGilla, Costello and Sean Garland, to place Belfast at the centre of their push for new left-wing Republican politics in the mid-60s. As a part of this, Northern Nationalists were keen to demonstrate that the Irish state could not just forget about them or ignore the fact that they were part of the Irish nation. Lacking a state apparatus, they organised through the communal institutions available. The speeches made at Northern commemorative events in April 1966, many given by Southern Republicans, or subversives as they were usually designated by the Southern state, were direct. They focused on what the speakers claimed to be the original spirit of '16, the failure to deliver Northern nationalism, and Irish-speaking Ireland or economic prosperity. Irish unity and an end to British rule was the core message, rather than exhortations on building a prosperous 26-county Ireland, which was the mantra south of the border. The Republicans did most of the organising in Belfast, and though they brought tens of thousands onto the streets during Easter '66, the Westminster election of March '66 had not merely returned Jerry fit over and above Republican opposition, but it demonstrated throughout the North that nationalist voters were more interested in supporting candidates like Fitt, who would go to Westminster, rather than Republicans. However paradoxical it might seem, the commemoration in Northern Ireland in 1966 was as partitionist as the commemoration in the Republic. This reflected in Northern Ireland, the reiteration of traditional messages included a refrain that insisted on Northern nationalists' place within the Irish nation, if not the Irish state. The tone of speeches was nostalgic and angry. Domestic events were one factor in this. If the commemoration, as conceived by the Irish state, functioned as a kind of bridge into modernity for that state, Northern nationalists' organisation of their own commemorations served to at least problematise that smooth journey. What the South wished to jettison by marching over the bridge of commemoration into normal modernity was precisely what Northern nationalism needed to hold on to and assert. Despite the shared cultural capital of Irish nationalism, the meanings of commemoration were radically different North and South. If the South could make this journey successfully, then that success implied that Northern nationalists were but a residue that could be jettisoned. Roy Johnson complained after the Northern commemorations that there had been too many decades of the Rosary in Catholic churchyards, too many Catholic resonances to the commemoration. As a Northern Protestant Republican, he wished that the non-sectarian nature, as he saw it, of Irish republicanism could have been reflected more accurately. But Northern Commemoration in 1966 shared more with the genre of 19th century nationalist funereal memorialising than it did with Southern state celebrations of achievement. It differed only in the degree that Catholicism and nationalism had become more synonymous through the entrenching of nationalism into Catholicism. It was, by definition, the political actions of people who represented themselves, at least on the day, as in bondage, as Davids to their unionist Goliath. The Nationalist Party, of course, was wary of commemoration because it had the capacity to highlight and open up all of this. For the same reason, of course, Republicans were its key supporters. I'll just finish now. Northern commemorations, as organised particularly in Belfast, may have prompted renewed interest in republicanism. But nationalist voting patterns and diminished support for Republican candidates, new movements within the nationalist community, the ending of nationalist, if not Republican, parliamentary abstentionism, the decision to support Fit for election to Westminster, all suggest that the 66 commemorations were not a catalyst for the Northern nationalist community, except insofar as they gave testimony to the continuation of a powerful, if disorientated, sense of attachment to the Irish nation in changing times. Despite divisions within Northern nationalism, a complex residue of attachment to the Irish nation and resentment at Southern indifference commanded a unified effort in 1966. The networks that facilitated the parades and displays, marches and processions, speeches and songs in 66 emanated from an organisational and iconographic range of those available to Northern nationalists through the preceding decades. What was new in 66 was the revised agenda of Southern Republicans in relation to their fellow Republicans in Belfast in particular. What was also new, I suppose, were new movements within Northern nationalist politics and the conjunction of these developments with pre-existing fault lines within the Unionist bloc made manifest in the street politics of Ian Paisley. It was the attempt to reform unionism and restructure Northern Ireland in the light of world change and of changes in the Republic in Britain that challenged unionism and strengthened Paisley. These changes, they're kind of fairly manifest, I would argue, in 65, 66. These changes also posed a challenge to Northern nationalism. The visibility of Northern nationalist commemoration in 66, confined though it was to nationalist areas, provided a focus for Paisley's objections to change. Lemass succeeded where O'Neill failed in negotiating a bridge. Southern commemoration paid lip service to the patriot dead, gestured to the nationalist past, but sought to shape the future in the allegedly normal modernity of the state. The Irish state sought to commemorate while rendering residual and under control the historical and cultural capital of Irish nationalist historical memory in 1966. That memory, they thought, was to be employed to advance the modern agenda of the state. I suppose the key point I'd like to make is that that the state did not control the commemorative process that it initiated, nor did other groupings. Thanks.